What would you do if your Halloween night turned into a real-life nightmare? Tonight, I'm sharing 11 true Halloween horror stories that actually happened on October 31st, shocking communities worldwide. These disturbing incidents will make you think twice about opening your door after dark. From deadly costume parties to sinister trick-or-treat encounters, these events really occurred. Tell me in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it there? Don't forget to subscribe to Haunted Fears for more terrifying true stories that will haunt your nightmares. What would you do if the person you trusted most in the world became your child's killer on Halloween night? Imagine handing your son candy, watching him smile, and knowing those would be his final moments of innocence. My name is Oliver, and I'm a retired detective from Houston, Texas. What I'm about to share with you happened in 1974, and it remains the most horrifying case I ever worked on. This story isn't just about Halloween horror. It's about betrayal, greed, and the death of childhood innocence in America. October 31st, 1974, started like any other Halloween in Pasadena, a quiet suburb of Houston. Children were excited, parents were preparing costumes, and the streets buzzed with anticipation. Alexander was a seemingly normal optician, a churchgoer, and a father of two. His neighbors knew him as a friendly man who always had a smile on his face. His 8-year-old son, Christopher, was thrilled about trick-or-treating that evening. The boy had been talking about Halloween for weeks, planning his costume, and dreaming about the candy he would collect. That evening, Alexander took Christopher and his daughter, along with some neighborhood children, trick-or-treating through their community. The group walked from house to house, laughing and collecting candy. Parents waved from doorways. The air smelled of autumn leaves, and everything seemed perfect. But Alexander was carrying a secret that would shock the entire nation. During the trick-or-treating route, Alexander handed out giant pixie sticks candy to 5 children, including his own son Christopher and daughter. He told the children these were special treats from a house that had already closed for the evening. The kids were excited. The giant candy tubes were a prized Halloween score. Nobody questioned where the candy came from. After all, Alexander was a trusted father figure in the community. When they returned home that night, Christopher asked his father if he could eat some of his Halloween candy before bed. Alexander encouraged him to try the pixie sticks. The boy tore open the giant straw filled with colored sugar and poured the powder into his mouth. Within minutes, Christopher began complaining that the candy tasted bitter. He told his father his stomach hurt. Alexander told him it was probably just too much excitement and sugar. But Christopher's condition deteriorated rapidly. He started vomiting violently. His small body convulsed. His mother, Natalie, rushed to him as he collapsed on the bathroom floor. His lips turned blue. His eyes rolled back. Natalie screamed for Alexander to call an ambulance, her hands shaking as she held her dying son. The paramedics arrived within minutes, but it was already too late. Christopher died before reaching the hospital. The medical team worked frantically to revive him, but nothing could be done. The poison had worked too quickly, too efficiently. At the hospital, doctors were baffled. A healthy 8-year-old boy didn't just die suddenly on Halloween night. They immediately suspected poisoning and ordered a toxicology screen. The results came back quickly: potassium cyanide, enough to kill several adults, let alone a child. The amount found in Christopher's system was staggering. This wasn't accidental contamination. This was murder. When I arrived at the hospital as the lead detective, Natalie was hysterical, screaming that someone had poisoned her baby. Alexander stood in the corner, his face pale, repeatedly asking how this could have happened. We immediately launched an investigation into every house the children had visited that night. Officers knocked on dozens of doors, questioned hundreds of neighbors, and collected candy samples from every child who had been trick-or-treating in the area. We were searching for a monster who had weaponized Halloween candy. Parents across Houston were panicking, throwing away their children's candy, afraid that a serial killer was targeting kids. But then we discovered something that changed everything. The other 4 children who received giant pixie sticks from Alexander hadn't eaten their candy yet. We confiscated those tubes immediately and had them tested. Every single one contained lethal doses of potassium cyanide. The poison had been carefully inserted into the straws, mixed with the sugar, and resealed. This was premeditated, calculated murder. The question became, which house had given out these poison candies? Alexander claimed he couldn't remember exactly which house it was, saying it was dark, and he had been focused on watching the children. But as we interviewed every single homeowner on the trick-or-treat route, not a single person admitted to giving out giant pixie sticks. In fact, nobody we interviewed had even had those candies to distribute. The story wasn't adding up. I sat across from Alexander in the interrogation room 3 days after his son's death. He maintained his story. Some unknown house had given him the candy to distribute to the children, but his body language told a different story. He wouldn't make eye contact. His hands trembled. He kept changing small details in his account. My instincts, honed from 20 years of detective work, were screaming that something was wrong. We started digging into Alexander's background. What we found was devastating. The man was drowning in debt. He owed thousands of dollars to creditors, was behind on his mortgage, and had been fired from multiple jobs for theft and embezzlement. He was desperate for money. And then we discovered the most damning evidence. Alexander had taken out life insurance policies on both of his children just weeks before Halloween. Christopher's policy was worth $10,000, a fortune in 1974. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Alexander hadn't received poisoned candy from a stranger. He had created the poisoned candy himself. He had purchased potassium cyanide from a chemical supply company, claiming he needed it for work. Experiments. He had carefully injected the poison into the giant pixie sticks, resealed them, and carried them in his pocket during trick-or-treating. He had given poisoned candy to other children as a cover, hoping that multiple poisonings would make it look like a random killer was targeting the neighborhood. Alexander had murdered his own son for insurance money. He had looked Christopher in the eyes, handed him poison, and watched him eat it. When the boy complained the candy tasted bitter, Alexander had done nothing. He had let his son die in agony, convulsing on the bathroom floor, so he could collect $10,000. The trial was one of the most publicized in Texas history. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence: the insurance policies, the purchased cyanide, the fact that no house on the trick-or-treat route had given out pixie sticks, and Alexander's crushing debt. Natalie testified against her husband, her voice breaking as she described watching Christopher die. The other parents whose children had received poisoned candy testified about the horror of realizing their kids had nearly been murdered as collateral damage. Alexander's defense tried to claim he was being framed, that some mysterious killer had planted the evidence. But the jury didn't believe him. The evidence was too overwhelming, too precise. On June 3, 1935, Alexander was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. He spent 9 years on death row, filing appeal after appeal, but every court rejected his claims. On March 31, 1984, Alexander was executed by lethal injection. His last words were a continued proclamation of innocence, but nobody believed him. Natalie refused to attend the execution. She'd already lost her son. Watching her husband die wouldn't bring Christopher back. But the damage Alexander caused extended far beyond his own family. Christopher's death created nationwide panic about Halloween candy tampering. Parents became terrified of trick-or-treating. Hospitals started offering free X-ray services to scan candy for foreign objects. Communities began organizing supervised Halloween events instead of traditional door-to-door trick-or-treating. The innocence of Halloween was shattered. Even today, 50 years later, parents warn their children not to accept unwrapped candy from strangers. The myth of widespread Halloween candy poisoning persists, even though Christopher's case remains one of the only confirmed instances of intentional candy poisoning. and it was committed by his own father. Alexander's greed didn't just kill his son. It killed the trust that allowed children to freely enjoy Halloween. I retired from the police force 15 years ago, but I still think about Christopher every Halloween. I think about his excitement that evening, clutching his trick-or-treat bag, completely unaware that his own father was carrying his death in his pocket. I think about those final moments, the bitter taste of poison, the confusion, the pain. An 8-year-old boy who trusted his father completely, murdered for an insurance payout that Alexander never even collected. The case taught me that monsters don't always hide in shadows or wear masks. Sometimes they sit at the dinner table. Sometimes they tuck you into bed. Sometimes they hand you candy on Halloween night and smile while you eat poison. The scariest horror stories aren't about strangers in the dark. They're about the people we trust most, the people who are supposed to protect us, who choose evil instead. Christopher's grave is in a small cemetery in Pasadena. Every Halloween, people still leave candy on his headstone. Wrapped candy, safe candy, candy that represents the childhood joy that was stolen from him. His mother, Natalie, visits regularly, though she's elderly now. She never remarried. She never had more children. Alexander destroyed her entire world that Halloween night. This story is why I'm sharing these accounts with you tonight. Halloween horror isn't always fictional. Sometimes the most terrifying things happen in real life, in quiet suburbs, in normal families. Sometimes evil wears a familiar face, and sometimes the scariest thing you can imagine is that someone could value money more than their own child's life. Christopher deserved to grow up. He deserved to experience 1,000 more Halloweens, to have children of his own, to live a full life. Instead, he's frozen forever at 8 years old, a victim of the ultimate betrayal. His story changed how America celebrates Halloween, and his memory serves as a permanent reminder that real monsters exist, and sometimes they're closer than we ever want to believe. Imagine watching your daughter skip toward a car on Halloween night, her costume sparkling under the streetlights, and that being the last time you ever see her alive. The sound of children's laughter would become the soundtrack to your worst nightmare. My name is Charlotte, and I live in Des Moines, Iowa. What happened on Halloween night in 1982 didn't just destroy my family. It changed how every parent in America views their child's safety. This is the story of how a simple newspaper collection route turned into a mystery that haunted our nation for decades. My daughter, Amelia, was 12 years old in 1982. She was responsible, bright, and mature for her age. She had a paper route in our neighborhood, delivering the Des Moines Register every morning before school. It wasn't unusual for her to collect payment from customers on occasion. And that Halloween evening, she decided to go collect from a few houses that owed money. It was still light outside when she left, around 5:30 p.m. She wore her favorite jacket and carried her collection bag. She told me she'd be back within an hour, in time to hand out candy to trick-or-treaters. I watched her walk down our driveway, waving goodbye. She turned back and smiled at me, her blonde hair catching the late afternoon sun. That image is burned into my memory. My daughter smiling, safe, innocent, with her whole life ahead of her. I had no idea that within the next hour she would vanish without a trace. When 7:00 p.m. came and Amelia hadn't returned, I started to worry. She was always punctual, always responsible. By 7:30 p.m., my worry turned to fear. My husband Theodore and I drove around the neighborhood, checking every house on her collection route. Most people hadn't seen her at all. A few remembered her stopping by earlier to collect payment, but nobody had seen her after 6 p.m. By 8 p.m., we called the police. The officer who took our report tried to reassure us that kids often lose track of time on Halloween, that she was probably at a friend's house. But I knew my daughter. Amelia wouldn't just disappear without telling us. Something was terribly wrong. I could feel it in every fiber of my being, a mother's instinct screaming that her child was in danger. The police began searching immediately. Officers canvassed the neighborhood, knocking on every door, asking if anyone had seen a 12-year-old girl with blonde hair carrying a newspaper collection bag. As darkness fell and more hours passed, the search intensified. Volunteers from our community joined the effort, walking through yards, searching parks, calling Amelia's name into the night. The sound of dozens of voices shouting my daughter's name, while trick-or-treaters continued their celebrations, felt surreal, like I was trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. Around 10 p.m., a witness came forward. A man named Dominic, who lived 2 blocks from our house, reported that he had seen Amelia talking to someone in a blue car around 6:15 p.m. He said she had been standing on the sidewalk near Ashworth Road, and a car had pulled up beside her. Dominic couldn't see the driver clearly, but he remembered that Amelia had leaned toward the car window, as if speaking to someone she might have known. Then she had walked around to the passenger side and gotten in. The car had driven away. This information both gave us hope and filled us with dread. If Amelia had gotten into a car willingly, perhaps she knew the person. Perhaps this was just a misunderstanding. But as the hours turned into days, and days turned into weeks, that hope crumbled into devastating reality. The FBI joined the investigation. Our home became a command center, filled with agents, phone equipment, and investigators working around the clock. They interviewed hundreds of people. They searched fields, abandoned buildings, rivers, and forests. They created age progression photos showing what Amelia might look like as she grew older. Her face appeared on milk cartons, billboards, and television screens across America. She became one of the first missing children to receive national attention, and her case helped launch the missing children's movement that would change how America responds to child abductions. Theodore and I appeared on every news program that would have us. We begged for information, pleaded with whoever had taken our daughter to bring her home. We offered rewards. We worked with child advocacy groups. We never stopped searching, never stopped hoping, even as months turned into years. Every birthday, every Christmas, every Halloween that passed without Amelia was torture. Her bedroom remained exactly as she left it. Her books on the shelf, her clothes in the closet, her bed waiting for her to come home. The investigation revealed disturbing possibilities. Police discovered that a man named Vincent had been in the area that day. Vincent was known to law enforcement. He had a history of inappropriate behavior around children. He lived in an apartment less than a mile from where Amelia was last seen. When police searched his apartment, they found photographs of young boys from the neighborhood, taken without their parents' knowledge. But there was no physical evidence linking him to Amelia's disappearance. Vincent denied ever seeing her, denied owning a blue car, denied everything. Without evidence, police couldn't charge him. For years, Vincent remained the primary suspect. Investigators monitored his movements, hoping he would slip up, reveal something, lead them to Amelia. But he never did. He eventually moved out of state, and the trail went cold. Theodore became obsessed with finding Vincent, following every lead, driving to different states to track his whereabouts. It consumed him. Our marriage struggled under the weight of our grief and obsession. How do you continue living when your child is missing? How do you find joy or peace or normalcy when every moment is filled with questions about what happened to your baby? 27 years passed. 27 Halloween nights came and went. I stopped answering the door on October 31st. The sound of children laughing, the doorbell ringing, the sight of costumes. It was all too painful. Amelia should have grown up, gone to college, gotten married, had children of her own. Instead, she was frozen in time as a 12-year-old girl in our memories and on missing person posters that yellowed with age. Then, in 2009, something extraordinary happened. A man named Julian walked into a police station in Illinois and confessed to murdering Amelia. Julian had been in prison for other crimes involving children, and his conscience, he claimed, finally compelled him to tell the truth. He described in horrifying detail how he had been driving through our neighborhood on Halloween night in 1982, looking for a victim. He saw Amelia walking alone, approached her in his blue car, and asked for directions. She had leaned toward his window to help him, trusting and kind as she always was. He told her he had something to show her, something related to her newspaper route, and asked her to get in the car for just a moment. Amelia, believing she was helping an adult, got into the car. Julian drove her to a remote area outside the city. He assaulted her, and then he killed her, disposing of her body in a location he described in detail. Based on his confession, investigators searched the area he indicated. They found remains. DNA testing confirmed what Theodore and I had feared for 27 years, but never wanted to believe. Our daughter was dead. She had been dead since that Halloween night in 1982. The grief of finally knowing was indescribable. For nearly 3 decades, we had held on to hope. Irrational, desperate hope that somehow Amelia was alive somewhere. That maybe she had amnesia. That maybe she had been taken by someone who raised her as their own. That maybe one day she would walk through our door. Learning the truth destroyed that hope and replaced it with the concrete horror of knowing our 12-year-old daughter had suffered and died alone, terrified, calling for us, and we hadn't been able to save her. Julian was already serving a life sentence for other crimes. He showed no remorse during his confession, describing Amelia's murder in clinical, detached terms that made me physically ill. The prosecutor added Amelia's murder to his charges, but it changed nothing. He would die in prison regardless. There was no justice to be found, no punishment severe enough for what he had taken from us. We buried Amelia's remains in a cemetery near our home. Her funeral, held 27 years after her death, was attended by hundreds of people. Investigators who had worked her case, volunteers who had searched for her, community members who had never forgotten her face on those milk cartons. We finally had a place to visit her, a grave where we could leave flowers, but it felt hollow. She should have been burying us, not the other way around. Theodore died 2 years after we buried Amelia. The doctors said it was a heart attack, but I know he died of a broken heart. For 29 years, he had lived with the torture of not knowing what happened to his daughter. The stress, the obsession, the grief, it consumed him from the inside. I scattered his ashes on Amelia's grave, reuniting father and daughter. I'm 78 years old now. I live alone in the same house where Amelia grew up, where she walked out the door that Halloween evening and never came back. People ask me why I don't move, why I stay in a place filled with such painful memories. But this house also holds the good memories. Amelia's first steps, her laughter echoing through these rooms, family dinners, bedtime stories. If I leave, I'm afraid I'll lose those memories too. Every Halloween, I turn off my porch light and sit in Amelia's room. I look at her school photos, her report cards, the drawings she made as a child. I think about the life she should have had. I think about the grandchildren I should have had. I think about all the conversations we never got to have, all the moments that were stolen by a monster who saw my beautiful daughter as nothing more than an opportunity to fulfill his sick desires. Amelia's case changed America. Her face on milk cartons started a movement that led to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, Amber Alerts, and national databases to track child predators. Her death made parents more cautious, more protective. Halloween became less about carefree trick-or-treating and more about supervised safety. In some ways, her legacy saved other children, but I would trade every policy change, every awareness campaign, every life saved to have my daughter back. This is why I'm sharing my story tonight. Monsters exist. They drive through neighborhoods in ordinary cars, looking for opportunities. They smile, ask for help, seem trustworthy, and in a moment, just one terrible moment, they destroy entire families. Amelia trusted an adult who asked for help. She was raised to be kind, to be helpful, and that goodness was used against her. To every parent watching this, hold your children close. don't let them out of your sight on Halloween or any other day. The world contains beautiful things, but it also contains evil that targets innocence. Amelia was smart, responsible, and careful, but it wasn't enough. One predator, one moment of vulnerability, and she was gone forever. I miss my daughter every single day. I miss who she was and who she would have become. Julian took everything from us, but he couldn't take our memories. Amelia was kind, funny, brilliant, and loved. She deserved to live. And I will spend whatever time I have left making sure people remember her name, remember her story, and protect their own children from suffering the same fate. What would you do if you were celebrating Halloween in a crowded room when suddenly the only exit burst into flames? The smell of burning fabric would be the last thing hundreds of people ever experienced. My name is Olivia, and I'm a burn survivor from the Bronx, New York. On March 25th, 1990, though it wasn't Halloween night, this tragedy happened at a Halloween-themed party. I experienced hell on Earth. What I'm about to tell you is the story of the Happy Land Fire, the deadliest fire in New York City's history, where 87 people died in a matter of minutes, many of them wearing costumes that melted into their skin. I was 23 years old in 1990, working as a waitress in the Bronx and living with my parents to save money. My best friend Emma had been begging me for weeks to go to the Happy Land Social Club with her. Happy Land was an illegal club. No liquor license, no fire exits, no sprinkler system. But it was popular in our community. They played the best music, and on weekends, the place was packed with people dancing, laughing, and forgetting about their problems for a few hours. That night, the club was hosting a special party. Though it was March, they called it a Halloween in Spring theme party, encouraging people to wear costumes. Emma wore a homemade witch costume with a long black dress made of cheap polyester. I wore a vampire cape over my regular clothes. I wasn't much into costumes, but I wanted to fit in. The club was located on the second floor of a small building on Southern Boulevard. To enter, you had to climb a narrow staircase, and that same staircase was the only way out. We arrived around 11 p.m. The club was already packed. At least 200 people crammed into a space designed for maybe 50. The music was loud, the air was thick with cigarette smoke and perfume, and bodies pressed together on the tiny dance floor. The windows were boarded up with metal gates, supposedly for security. There were no exit signs, no fire extinguishers visible, no emergency lighting. But we were young and careless. We just wanted to dance and have fun. Around 3:30 a.m., I was standing near the bar talking to Emma when I heard shouting near the entrance. At first, I thought it was just drunk people arguing. That happened sometimes at clubs. But then I smelled it. Gasoline. The scent was unmistakable and terrifying. Before I could process what was happening, I heard a sound like a whoosh, and suddenly the stairwell, the only exit, was completely engulfed in flames. Panic erupted instantly. People started screaming, pushing, running in every direction. The fire spread with horrifying speed, racing across the wooden floor that had been coated with years of spilled alcohol and wax. The flames were blue and orange, climbing the walls, spreading across the ceiling. The heat was unbearable, like standing inside an oven. And the worst part, the absolutely worst part, was watching people's costumes catch fire. Emma's polyester witch dress ignited like it had been soaked in lighter fluid. One moment she was standing next to me, and the next she was covered in flames. She screamed, a sound I still hear in my nightmares, and tried to pat out the fire, but it just spread faster. Her face, her hair, her hands, everything was burning. I tried to help her, tried to smother the flames with my cape, but the fire was too intense. People were running past us, trampling anyone who fell, desperate to escape. The metal gates on the windows became death traps. People clawed at them, screaming for help, but they were locked from the outside. I watched a man named Adrian try to pry one open with his bare hands, the skin on his palms melting against the hot metal. The smoke was getting thicker, blacker, filling our lungs with toxic fumes. People were dropping to the floor, not from burns, but from smoke inhalation, their bodies convulsing as they gasped for air that wasn't there. I don't know how I survived those first few minutes. Instinct took over. I remembered reading somewhere that you should stay low in a fire because smoke rises. I dropped to my hands and knees and started crawling toward what I thought might be a back room, hoping for another exit, any exit. Bodies were everywhere, some still moving, some already still. The floor was hot enough to burn my palms. The smoke was so thick I couldn't see more than a few inches in front of my face. I found a small bathroom and crawled inside, slamming the door behind me. 3 other people were already there, 2 women and a man I didn't recognize. We pressed towels against the crack under the door, trying to keep the smoke out, but it seeped in anyway. We could hear the screaming outside, the roar of the fire, the sound of the building groaning as the structure weakened. One of the women was praying in Spanish, her voice shaking. The man kept trying to open the tiny bathroom window, but it was painted shut and wouldn't budge. We stayed in that bathroom for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes. The temperature kept rising. The walls were getting hot to the touch. We knew we were going to die. There was no way out. The fire was going to break through that door eventually, and we would burn alive, or suffocate from the smoke. I thought about my parents, about how they would identify my body, about how I had wasted my last conversation with them arguing about something stupid I couldn't even remember. Then we heard the firefighters, the sound of axes breaking through walls, water spraying, voices shouting commands. The man in the bathroom with us started pounding on the door and screaming for help. Within minutes, firefighters broke through and pulled us out. I was conscious enough to see the devastation as they carried me through what remained of the club. Bodies were piled near the entrance, people who had tried to escape through the burning stairwell and failed. Some bodies were burned beyond recognition. Others looked almost peaceful, as if they had simply fallen asleep, killed by smoke before the flames reached them. Emma's body was found near where I last saw her. The fire had been so intense that they identified her through dental records. 17 other people were wearing costumes that night, and the synthetic fabrics had turned their bodies into human torches. The medical examiner later testified that some victims had burns so severe that their skin had melted completely off their bones. I spent 3 months in the hospital burn unit. 30% of my body was covered in 2nd and 3rd degree burns. My hands, my arms, parts of my face. The pain was indescribable. They had to scrub the dead skin off my burns every day, a process so agonizing that I begged them to just let me die. I had multiple skin graft surgeries. I lost count of how many times I screamed, how many times I wished the fire had killed me too. During my recovery, I learned the full story of what had happened that night. A man named Elijah had started the fire. He was the ex-boyfriend of a woman who worked at the club, and they had gotten into an argument earlier that evening. The bouncer had thrown Elijah out. Enraged and drunk, Elijah went to a gas station, bought $1 worth of gasoline in a plastic container, returned to Happy Land, and poured it on the stairs. He lit a match and walked away. 87 people died because one man was angry about a breakup. 87 mothers, fathers, daughters, sons, friends, gone in minutes because of one act of revenge. The fire inspector later said that if Happy Land had been a legal club with proper fire exits, sprinkler systems, and non-flammable materials, most people would have survived. But the club's owner had cut corners, bribed inspectors, and prioritized profit over safety. Elijah was arrested the next day. He had gone home and gone to sleep, apparently unconcerned that he had just committed mass murder. During his trial, he showed no remorse. He was convicted on 87 counts of murder and sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. The club owner was charged with criminally negligent homicide but received a much lighter sentence, just 2 years. 2 years for creating a death trap that killed 87 people. The funerals went on for weeks. Our community was devastated. Many of the victims were from Honduras and other Central American countries, working-class immigrants who'd come to America for a better life and died in a fire trap because they wanted one night of entertainment. Families had to scrape together money to send bodies back to their home countries. Some victims were so badly burned that their families never got to see them one last time. I was in a wheelchair at Emma's funeral. My hands were still bandaged, my face still scarred. Her mother collapsed when she saw me, screaming that I should have saved her daughter, that I should have died instead. I understood her pain. I felt the same guilt. Why did I survive when Emma didn't? Why did I get to crawl into that bathroom while she burned to death just feet away from me? That guilt consumed me for years. I had survivor's guilt so severe that I attempted suicide twice. The physical scars were terrible. I would never look the same, never be able to use my hands normally, never escape the stares from strangers. But the psychological scars were worse. I had PTSD that made me terrified of crowds, enclosed spaces, locked doors. I couldn't hear sirens without having panic attacks. The smell of smoke, even from a barbecue or fireplace, would send me into flashbacks so vivid that I would collapse. Physical therapy took years. I had to relearn how to use my hands, how to hold a fork, how to button my shirt. The skin grafts never looked quite right. Patches of different colored skin sewn together like a quilt. Children would stare at me in public. Adults would look away quickly, uncomfortable with my appearance. Dating became impossible. Who wants to be with someone whose body is a reminder of death and tragedy? I'm 57 years old now. 35 years have passed since that night, but I live with it every single day. I see the scars every time I look in the mirror. I feel the stiffness in my hands every time I try to pick something up. I smell phantom smoke that isn't there. I hear Emma's screams in my sleep, but I'm still here. 87 people didn't get a second chance. They didn't get to grow old, have children, experience life beyond that horrible night. I survived for a reason, and I've spent decades making sure their deaths weren't meaningless. I testified in front of city councils about fire safety. I worked with organizations to close illegal clubs. I shared my story at schools and community centers, warning people about the dangers of ignoring fire codes and safety regulations. The Happy Land fire changed New York City's approach to illegal social clubs. Enforcement became stricter, penalties became harsher, but it shouldn't have taken 87 deaths to make those changes. Those people should still be alive. This Halloween, or anytime you go out to celebrate, look for the exits. Count how many there are. Make sure they're not blocked or locked. Check for fire extinguishers, sprinkler systems, proper lighting. Don't assume that because a place is crowded and popular, it's safe. Happy Land was packed every weekend, and it was a death trap waiting to happen. And if you're wearing a costume, be aware of the fabric. Synthetic materials like polyester can go up in flames in seconds. Natural fabrics like cotton are safer. It seems like a small detail, but when Emma's dress caught fire, she had no chance. The costume that was supposed to bring joy became the instrument of her death. I tell this story not to scare people, but to educate them. Real horror isn't ghosts or monsters. Real horror is preventable tragedy. 87 people dying because one man wanted revenge and one club owner wanted to save money on safety equipment. Real horror is watching your best friend burn alive and being powerless to save her. Real horror is living with the knowledge that you survived when so many others didn't, and spending the rest of your life wondering why. What would you do if you walked through a Halloween attraction laughing at a prop body, only to discover hours later that you had watched a real person die? The line between performance and reality would haunt you forever. My name is Ava, and I work as an emergency room nurse in Louisville, Kentucky. What happened on Halloween night in 2000 at a local haunted house attraction changed how I view entertainment, trust, and the fragility of human life. This is the story of how hundreds of people walked past a dying man, assuming his suffering was just part of the show, while he desperately needed help that never came. I wasn't working the night it happened. I was actually attending the haunted house with my sister Mia and her boyfriend. We had heard amazing things about Creepy World Haunted House, a popular Halloween attraction that had been running for years. They were known for their realistic props, talented actors, and genuinely terrifying experience. People came from surrounding states just to walk through their elaborate setups. The attraction employed about 30 actors each night during October. One of them was a man I'll call Maxwell. He was 42 years old, a construction worker by day, who did haunted house acting as a side job during Halloween season. He had been working at Creepy World for 3 years and was known for his dedication. He would stay in character no matter what, never breaking the illusion, always committed to giving visitors the most authentic scare possible. Maxwell's role that night was the Hanged Man. His scene was set up in a mock gallows area designed to look like an old Western execution site. He would stand on a platform with a noose around his neck, positioned so it looked like he was hanging but actually supported by a harness hidden under his costume. When groups walked through, he would twitch and convulse, making gasping sounds, his eyes rolling back. It was disturbingly realistic. That was the point. The harness system had been used safely for years. It was designed to take Maxwell's weight while making it appear that the noose was supporting him. But that night, something went terribly wrong. The harness malfunctioned. Nobody knows exactly when it happened, whether it was a mechanical failure, improper setup, or gradual wear that finally gave way. But at some point during the evening, the harness failed, and the noose that was supposed to be a prop became a real instrument of death. Maxwell found himself actually hanging, the rope cutting off his air supply, his body weight pulling the noose tighter around his throat. He couldn't call for help. He couldn't breathe. He struggled, genuinely fought for his life, his body convulsing not from acting, but from suffocation. And hundreds of people walked past him, thinking it was the best performance they had ever seen. My sister, her boyfriend, and I entered the haunted house around 8:30 p.m. We paid our tickets, signed the waiver, acknowledging that actors might touch us and that the experience would be intense, and entered the first scene. The production quality was impressive. Realistic props, talented actors, perfectly timed sound effects and lighting. We screamed and laughed, clutching each other as zombies lunged at us and chainsaws roared in the darkness. When we reached Maxwell's scene, the gallows area, we stopped and watched like everyone else. A spotlight illuminated a man hanging from a noose, his body twitching violently. His face was purple and swollen, his eyes bulging, his fingers clawing at the rope around his neck. Foam was coming from his mouth. The detail was incredible. "This is so realistic," Mia whispered, genuinely impressed. Other visitors in our group were taking photos, pointing out how authentic the makeup looked, how committed the actor was to his role. We stood there for maybe 30 seconds, watching Maxwell die, before moving on to the next scene. Nobody helped him. Nobody called for assistance. Nobody suspected that what we were watching was real. The line between theatrical horror and actual death had blurred so completely that we couldn't distinguish one from the other. We were trained by society to assume that disturbing things in Halloween attractions are fake, and that assumption killed Maxwell. We finished the haunted house tour around 9 p.m., still buzzing with adrenaline, discussing our favorite scares. "That hanging guy was incredible," Mia's boyfriend said. "I don't know how he stayed in character like that. His face was actually purple." We all agreed it was the most realistic effect we had ever seen. We took some photos outside the attraction, got hot chocolate from a vendor, and headed home, completely unaware that we had just witnessed a murder, not by intent, but by collective inability to recognize reality. Around 11 p.m., I received a call from the hospital. They were short-staffed and needed me to come in for an emergency shift. I arrived at the ER around 11:30 p.m. and immediately noticed the somber mood among the staff. One of the doctors pulled me aside. "We just had a DOA come in from that haunted house attraction, Creepy World. The guy was actually hanging. Visitors thought it was part of the show. By the time staff realized something was wrong, he had been dead for at least an hour." My blood ran cold. "The hanging scene?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The doctor nodded. "Yeah. Apparently the harness failed. He was actually hanging there, suffocating, and people just walked past him thinking it was acting. Some even took photos with him. I felt physically sick. I had stood there. I had watched him die. I had admired the realism of his suffering. Mia and I had literally watched a man in his final moments of life, gasping for air, struggling desperately, and we had done nothing. We had smiled, been entertained, and moved on to the next scene. The investigation revealed the horrifying timeline. Maxwell's harness had failed. Around 7:45 p.m. For over 2 hours, he hung there actually dying while hundreds of visitors walked past. Some reports estimated that between 200 and 300 people saw him in distress and assumed it was acting. Several visitors had commented to staff that the hanging guy was really committed tonight, or that actor is incredible, it looks so real. Around 9:30 p.m., a staff member noticed that Maxwell wasn't responding to the radio check-ins that actors were supposed to do periodically. She went to his scene and found him hanging limply, no longer moving. She called his name. No response. She touched him and felt how cold his skin was. That's when she realized. She started screaming for help, but it was too late. Maxwell had been dead for at least an hour, possibly longer. The paramedics arrived and cut him down. They attempted resuscitation, but there was nothing they could do. The medical examiner later determined that he had died of asphyxiation, likely within 10 to 15 minutes of the harness failure. Those violent convulsions that we thought were brilliant acting, those were his death throes. That purple swollen face, that was real suffocation. The foam from his mouth, that was his body shutting down. The haunted house was immediately shut down, and police cordoned off the scene as a potential crime site, though it was quickly determined to be accidental death rather than homicide. The investigation focused on the harness system. Engineers examined the equipment and found that a critical support strap had frayed and snapped. The equipment should have been inspected regularly, but records showed that safety checks had been neglected. The haunted house owner had prioritized keeping the attraction running over proper maintenance. Maxwell's family filed a wrongful death lawsuit. During the trial, I was called as a witness because I had been at the ER that night and had also visited the attraction. Sitting in that courtroom, describing how I had watched Maxwell die and thought it was entertainment, was one of the most shameful moments of my life. His wife sat in the front row, crying. His 2 teenage children stared at me with hollow eyes. I had to admit, under oath, that I had seen their husband and father struggling, suffocating, dying, and I had been impressed by the performance. The defense tried to argue that Maxwell's death was a tragic accident, that nobody could have known the harness would fail. But the prosecution presented evidence of multiple safety violations. The equipment hadn't been inspected in over a year. The owner had no safety protocols in place. Actors received minimal training. There was no emergency communication system for actors to signal distress. Maxwell had been essentially abandoned in that scene, expected to perform for hours with no supervision, and no way to call for help if something went wrong. The jury awarded Maxwell's family over $2 million in damages. The haunted house was permanently closed. The owner faced criminal negligence charges, but received only probation and a fine. Nowhere near adequate punishment for creating conditions that led to a man's death. New regulations were passed requiring haunted house attractions to have safety inspectors, regular equipment checks, emergency communication systems, and trained safety monitors. But those regulations came too late for Maxwell. The psychological impact on the visitors who saw Maxwell die has been devastating. A support group was formed for people who witnessed his death, because many of us developed severe PTSD. We had unknowingly participated in a man's death, had been entertained by his suffering. The guilt was overwhelming. Some people in the group talked about suicide attempts. Others couldn't enter any kind of entertainment venue without having panic attacks. Several people, including me, developed an obsessive need to check if things were real or fake, constantly questioning whether what we were seeing was authentic. I can't watch horror movies anymore. I can't go to Halloween attractions. Even theatrical performances make me anxious. Every time I see someone portraying distress, I wonder, is that real? Is someone actually hurt? Am I watching entertainment or witnessing tragedy? The line that used to be clear is now permanently blurred. I second-guess everything. Mia stopped celebrating Halloween entirely. She removed all the photos from that night, but she can't erase the memories. She still has nightmares about Maxwell's purple face, his bulging eyes, his desperate clawing at the rope. In her dreams, she hears him calling for help, but in the dream, she still can't tell if it's real or acting, and she walks away while he dies. What haunts me most is the realization of how easily we dismiss real suffering when it's presented in the context of entertainment. We've been conditioned to believe that disturbing things in certain contexts are fake. Halloween attractions, movies, haunted houses. We assume safety, assume performance, assume that someone is in control and nobody is actually being harmed. That assumption allows us to enjoy horror, but it also means we might walk past real emergencies without recognizing them. Maxwell died alone, surrounded by people. He died while hundreds watched. He died performing, committed to his role until the very end, unable to break character because he physically couldn't speak, couldn't signal, couldn't do anything but suffer. And we rewarded his authentic death with applause, with photos, with admiration for his dedication to the craft. I think about Maxwell constantly. I think about his final thoughts as he hung there, feeling the rope tighten, unable to breathe, watching groups of people walk past, laughing and smiling. Did he try to signal them somehow? Did he hope someone would notice? Did he feel betrayed that nobody helped? Did he understand that people thought it was fake? Or did he die confused and terrified, wondering why strangers were watching him suffocate and doing nothing? His wife told me, years later, that Maxwell had mentioned the harness felt loose that night. He had told the owner, but was assured it was fine, that they needed to keep the attraction running, that they couldn't shut down a scene on a busy Halloween weekend. So Maxwell, being dedicated and responsible, went back to his position. He trusted that the equipment was safe. He trusted that his employer valued his life. That trust killed him. This Halloween, if you visit attractions, really look. Look at the safety equipment. Look at the actors. If something feels wrong, if someone seems genuinely distressed, say something. Don't assume it's all part of the show. Don't let social conditioning prevent you from recognizing real emergencies. Maxwell died because hundreds of people, including me, assumed his suffering was entertainment. I'm 51 years old now. 25 years have passed since that night. I'm still a nurse, still save lives when I can. But I carry Maxwell's death with me every single day. I watched him die and did nothing. That makes me complicit, regardless of intent. Real horror isn't jump scares or scary costumes. Real horror is walking past someone who desperately needs help, being entertained by their suffering, and realizing too late that you could have saved them, but didn't. That guilt never fades. That knowledge never stops haunting you. And no amount of time will ever make it okay that I watched Maxwell die and thought it was a brilliant performance. Have you ever watched your childhood home burn to the ground while your neighbors cheered in the streets? The night before, Halloween 1984, Detroit became a war zone where entire blocks disappeared in flames. My name is Grace, and I'm a retired firefighter from Detroit, Michigan. For 30 years, I've carried the weight of October 30th, 1984, the night we called Devil's Night, when over 800 fires were deliberately set across my city in a coordinated attack that turned neighborhoods into infernos. What I witnessed that night wasn't just arson. It was domestic terrorism, community collapse, and the death of a city's soul. I was 26 years old in 1984, one of only a handful of female firefighters in the Detroit Fire Department. The job was brutal, physically demanding, dangerous, and filled with men who didn't think women belonged in firehouses. But I loved it. I loved saving lives, protecting my community, being part of something bigger than myself. Detroit was struggling economically in the early 1980s, with factories closing and unemployment rising, but it was still my home. I believed in this city. Devil's Night had always been a problem in Detroit. The tradition started innocently enough, teenagers pulling harmless pranks on the night before Halloween, toilet papering houses, soaping windows, throwing eggs. But by the early 1980s, it had evolved into something darker. Abandoned buildings would be set on fire, a few dozen blazes each year concentrated in neglected neighborhoods. It was manageable, though disturbing. Nobody was prepared for what happened in 1984. My shift started at 6 p.m. on October 30th. Our captain gathered us for a briefing. "It's Devil's Night," he said. "Expect fires. Stay alert. Watch each other's backs." We nodded. We'd been through Devil's Night before. We were professionals. We could handle it. The first call came at 7:23 p.m., a house fire on the east side. We responded, extinguished it quickly. Obvious arson. The second call came before we'd even returned to the station. Another house fire, 3 blocks away. Then another. And another. By 9 p.m., every fire company in Detroit was responding to active fires, and the calls were still coming in faster than we could respond. The dispatcher's voice over the radio became increasingly frantic. Engine 23, structure fire on Gratiot Avenue. Engine 17, multiple houses burning on West Grand Boulevard. Ladder 6, apartment building fully involved on Woodward. The addresses kept coming, an endless stream of emergencies, more fires than we had equipment to fight. I was riding on Engine 42 that night. Our driver, a veteran named Harrison, had been fighting fires for 20 years. I'd never seen him scared before, but that night his hands shook on the steering wheel. "Grace," he said, "I've never seen anything like this. The whole city is burning." He was right. As we drove through Detroit, responding to calls, I could see the orange glow of fires in every direction. Pillars of smoke rose into the night sky, so many that they merged into a dark cloud hanging over the city. The smell of burning wood, plastic, and chemicals was overwhelming. Ash fell like snow, coating everything in gray powder. We arrived at a house fire on the east side around 10:30 p.m. The entire structure was engulfed, flames shooting through the roof, windows exploding from the heat, the front porch collapsing. We started our attack, but before we could make any progress, a group of teenagers appeared across the street. They were laughing, pointing at the fire, filming it with video cameras. One of them shouted, "Burn, baby, burn!" Another threw a bottle at our fire engine. Harrison yelled at them to back off, but they just laughed. Then, while we were focused on the first fire, they ran to a house 2 doors down and broke a window. Within minutes, that house was also on fire. They had started a new blaze right in front of us while we were trying to save the first building. We called for police backup, but the dispatcher said all officers were already deployed. There weren't enough police to protect firefighters, investigate arsons, and maintain order. We were on our own. The arsonists knew it. They were treating the city like a playground, setting fires for entertainment, challenging us to keep up. Around midnight, we received a call that made my blood run cold. An occupied house, a family still inside, was on fire on Mack Avenue. We rushed to the scene, arriving to find a two-story home fully involved with flames. A woman was screaming on the front lawn. My babies are still inside." Harrison and I grabbed our equipment and made entry. The smoke was so thick we couldn't see our hands in front of our faces. The heat was intense, melting the plastic on our helmets. We crawled through the first floor, searching, calling out. Nothing. We found the stairs and climbed to the second floor. The fire was spreading rapidly, the floor beneath us creaking ominously. In a back bedroom, I found them. 2 children, maybe 6 and 8 years old, unconscious on the floor near a window. I grabbed one child, Harrison grabbed the other, and we carried them out. The medics worked on them frantically. Both children survived, but they had severe smoke inhalation and burns. Their mother collapsed in relief and rage, screaming at the sky, "Why? Why would someone do this?" I didn't have an answer. There was no answer. The arsonists weren't targeting specific people or buildings. They were burning everything: occupied homes, abandoned houses, businesses, churches, schools. Some fires were started with Molotov cocktails. Others used gasoline poured through mail slots. Some arsonists simply broke windows and threw lit matches inside. By 2 a.m., Detroit had over 300 active fires burning simultaneously. We didn't have enough fire companies to respond to all of them. Dispatchers had to prioritize. Occupied buildings first, then businesses, then abandoned structures. Hundreds of fires were left to burn unchecked because we simply didn't have the resources. I watched entire blocks disappear. Houses that families had owned for generations turned to ash in minutes. Small businesses that had survived the economic recession, destroyed by teenagers looking for excitement. Churches, where communities gathered, reduced to charred ruins. The destruction was total and indiscriminate. The worst part was the people watching. Not everyone was trying to stop the fires. Many were celebrating them. I saw crowds gathering to watch buildings burn, treating it like entertainment. People brought lawn chairs, beer, and food. They cheered when roofs collapsed, when walls fell. Some neighborhoods felt like block parties, except the centerpiece was destruction. Around 4 a.m., exhausted and covered in soot, we responded to another fire. This one was in a neighborhood I recognized, my own childhood street. The house burning was my grandmother's house, where I'd spent summers as a child, where my family had gathered for holidays. I stood there, watching it burn, unable to do anything. We were so overwhelmed with emergencies that we couldn't spare resources for an abandoned building, even one that held my personal memories. I watched my grandmother's house collapse, taking with it photo albums, furniture, the piano she taught me to play on, decades of family history, gone in 30 minutes because some stranger decided it would be fun to watch something burn. Dawn finally came around 6:30 a.m. As light broke over Detroit, the full scale of the devastation became visible. Entire neighborhoods looked like war zones. Blocks of houses reduced to smoking foundations. Cars burned to metal skeletons. Trees scorched black. The smell of smoke was so pervasive that it would linger for weeks. The final count: over 800 fires in a single night. 3 people dead, dozens injured. Hundreds of families homeless. Millions of dollars in property damage. Entire neighborhoods destroyed. And the arsonists, most were never caught. They blended back into their communities, went to school the next day, lived their normal lives, while the city burned in their wake. The Devil's Night of 1984 changed Detroit forever. It exposed how fragile social order really is, how quickly a city can descend into chaos. It showed that when enough people decide to destroy rather than build, when entertainment becomes more valuable than community, civilization can collapse in a single night. I continued working as a firefighter for another 26 years after that night. Every Devil's Night brought more fires, though never again on the scale of 1984. The city eventually organized massive volunteer patrols, thousands of citizens walking the streets on October 30th, watching for arsonists, protecting their neighborhoods. It helped, but it couldn't erase what had happened. The psychological impact on firefighters was devastating. Several of my colleagues developed PTSD. Some turned to alcohol to cope with the helplessness of watching a city burn while being unable to stop it. 2 firefighters from my station took their own lives within 5 years, the trauma too much to bear. We saved lives that night, but we couldn't save the city's soul. Detroit never fully recovered. The Devil's Night arsons accelerated the city's decline. Businesses left, families moved to suburbs, property values plummeted. Why invest in a community where your building might be burned down for fun? The fires of 1984 didn't just destroy buildings, they destroyed trust, hope, and the belief that Detroit could be saved. I'm 66 years old now, retired for 10 years. Every October 30th, I drive through the neighborhoods we fought to save that night. Some blocks have been rebuilt. Others remain vacant lots, grass growing where houses once stood. The scars from Devil's Night 1984 are still visible if you know where to look. Empty spaces in otherwise occupied streets, marking where homes used to be. The children I saved from that fire on Mack Avenue are adults now, in their 40s with children of their own. One of them found me years later to say thank you. She doesn't remember that night. She was unconscious when I carried her out, but she knows she wouldn't exist without firefighters who risked their lives. That conversation gave me some peace, a reminder that despite the overwhelming destruction, we saved lives that mattered. But I still carry anger about Devil's Night 1984, anger at the arsonists who destroyed their own community for entertainment, anger at the economic conditions that created so much desperation and nihilism, anger at a society that let a city decay until burning it down seemed like reasonable recreation for teenagers, anger at my own helplessness that night, watching neighborhood after neighborhood disappear while I could only save a fraction. This story isn't about a single killer or one victim. It's about collective destruction, about what happens when a community turns on itself, when celebration becomes indistinguishable from violence. Halloween should be about harmless fun, costumes and candy and laughter. But in Detroit, on Devil's Night 1984, it became about watching your city burn while arsonists cheered and firefighters wept. Real horror isn't monsters or ghosts. Real horror is standing in the street at 3 a.m., surrounded by fires in every direction, knowing you can't possibly save everything, forced to choose which buildings burn and which ones you try to protect. Real horror is watching teenagers celebrate the destruction of their own neighborhoods, too young or too damaged to understand what they're destroying. Real horror is a city eating itself alive while the world watches. I fought fires for 30 years. I've seen deaths, injuries, disasters, but nothing compared to Devil's Night 1984, the night Detroit burned, the night I learned that communities can self-destruct, the night I watched my city die. Some fires you can extinguish, others burn too hot, spread too fast, and all you can do is witness the destruction and try to save whoever you can from the ashes. The doorbell kept ringing while my family's bodies grew cold in the rooms behind me. I stood there, smiling at trick-or-treaters, handing out candy with blood still wet on my hands. My name is Lily, and I'm a forensic psychologist who has spent 20 years studying the mind of my own brother. On Halloween night 1974, while children dressed as ghosts and superheroes knocked on our door in Illinois, my brother, a man I'll call Isaac, murdered our entire family and continued the charade of normalcy, distributing candy to unsuspecting children while our parents and siblings lay dead just feet away. I was 16 years old that night, the second oldest of 5 children. Isaac was 22, recently discharged from the military, living in our parents' basement while he figured things out. He'd always been different, quiet, detached, prone to violent outbursts as a child. But our parents believed he just needed time, needed support, needed love to overcome whatever darkness lived inside him. Halloween 1974 was supposed to be special. Our mother had decorated the house elaborately, hanging fake spider webs, carving pumpkins, preparing bowls of candy for the neighborhood children. Our father had taken the evening off from his factory job to help hand out treats. My younger siblings, Nicholas, 14, Hannah, 11, and Chloe, 8, were excited about trick-or-treating after helping with door duty for the early groups. I had plans to attend a Halloween party with friends and was upstairs getting ready around 6 p.m. when I heard the first scream. It came from the kitchen, my mother's voice, suddenly cut short. I froze, mascara wand in my hand, listening. Silence. Then my father's voice, shouting Isaac's name. A loud crash. More silence. I should have run. Every instinct screamed at me to escape through my bedroom window, to flee whatever was happening downstairs. But these were my parents, my siblings. I couldn't abandon them. I crept to my bedroom door and opened it slowly, peering into the hallway. Isaac stood at the bottom of the stairs looking up at me. His face was blank, emotionless. Blood covered his shirt and hands. He held a kitchen knife, the blade dripping red onto our mother's cream-colored carpet. "Don't come down here, Lily," he said calmly, as if warning me about a spilled drink rather than a massacre. I ran back into my room and locked the door, my hand shaking so badly I could barely turn the lock. I heard Isaac climbing the stairs, his footsteps slow and deliberate. I shoved my dresser against the door, grabbed the phone on my nightstand, and dialed 911. The operator answered, and I whispered frantically, "My brother is killing my family. Please send help. Please." Isaac tried my doorknob. "Lily, open the door. I'm not going to hurt you. You're the only one who ever understood me." His voice was eerily calm, conversational. I pressed myself against the far wall, clutching the phone, listening to the operator tell me help was coming, to stay on the line, to stay quiet. Then the doorbell rang. Trick-or-treaters, their cheerful voices calling trick or treat. Isaac stopped trying my door. I heard him walk back downstairs. I heard our front door open. I heard my brother's voice, friendly and warm. "Well, look at all these wonderful costumes. Let me get you some candy." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. He was answering the door. He was handing out candy to children while my family lay murdered in our house. The cognitive dissonance was paralyzing. How could someone transition so seamlessly from killing his own family to cheerfully engaging with trick-or-treaters? The operator stayed on the line with me, whispering reassurances that police were en route. I could hear everything happening downstairs through my bedroom floor. The doorbell would ring. Isaac would open it. Children would shout their greetings. Isaac would compliment their costumes, drop candy into their bags, wish them a happy Halloween. Then the door would close, and there would be silence until the next group arrived. This continued for 15 minutes that felt like hours. How many children had Isaac smiled at? How many parents had seen him and thought nothing was wrong? He was covered in blood. Didn't anyone notice? Later, I learned that many people had noticed, but assumed it was a costume, Halloween makeup, part of the festive spirit. One parent even complimented him on his realistic fake blood. Police arrived silently, without sirens surrounding our house. I heard them announce their presence, ordering Isaac to come out with his hands up. There was a moment of silence. Then Isaac's voice, still eerily calm, "I'm coming out. I'm unarmed." I heard the front door open, heard officers shouting commands, heard the click of handcuffs. Only then did I move my dresser and unlock my bedroom door. An officer met me in the hallway, gently preventing me from going downstairs. "Don't look," he said. "Please don't look." But I did look. I saw my mother first, in the kitchen, lying in a pool of blood near the stove where she'd been preparing dinner. Multiple stab wounds to her chest and throat. My father was in the living room, also stabbed repeatedly. Defensive wounds on his hands showing he'd tried to fight back. Nicholas was in the hallway, probably killed trying to protect our younger sisters. Hannah and Chloe were in the family room, huddled together, both stabbed in the back as they tried to hide behind the couch. Isaac had methodically murdered all of them in less than 20 minutes. Then he'd calmly cleaned the blood off his hands and face just enough to appear presentable, straightened his shirt, and resumed answering the door to trick-or-treaters as if nothing had happened. The forensic investigation revealed the timeline. Isaac had attacked our mother around 6:05 p.m. while she cooked. Our father heard her scream and ran to help, becoming the second victim. Nicholas emerged from his room and was killed in the hallway. The girls, hearing the commotion, tried to hide and were found and murdered. All 5 were dead by 6:25 p.m. The first trick-or-treaters arrived around 6:30 p.m., and Isaac answered the door covered in blood. The trial was a media sensation. The Halloween killer, they called him, the man who handed out candy over his family's bodies. Psychiatrists evaluated Isaac extensively. He was diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, and showed clear psychopathic traits. But he was deemed competent to stand trial, fully aware that killing his family was wrong. His motive. He felt they were holding him back. Our parents had asked him to find a job or move out. His siblings annoyed him. He felt entitled to the house, to our parents' money, to a life without responsibilities or accountability. So he eliminated the obstacles. The chilling part was how little emotion he showed discussing it. He described killing our mother the same way someone might describe doing laundry, a task that needed completing. I testified at his trial, looking at Isaac across the courtroom, trying to reconcile this monster with the brother I'd grown up with, was surreal. He showed no remorse, no grief, no recognition of the enormity of what he'd done. When asked why he'd answered the door to trick-or-treaters after the murders, he shrugged. It was Halloween. Kids were expecting candy. I didn't want to disappoint them. That statement revealed everything about Isaac's psychology. He could perform normalcy perfectly, could mimic appropriate social behavior, but felt no genuine emotion behind it. The murders meant nothing to him. Handing out candy meant nothing to him. Both were just actions to be performed, tasks on a list, devoid of moral weight or emotional significance. Isaac was convicted on 5 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. He's now 72 years old, still incarcerated, still showing no remorse. I've visited him periodically over the years as part of my research into psychopathy and family annihilators. Each conversation reinforces what I learned that Halloween night. Some people are fundamentally broken, incapable of empathy, viewing other humans as objects to be used or discarded. The parents whose children received candy from Isaac that night were traumatized when they learned the truth. Several required therapy, haunted by the knowledge that their kids had interacted with a mass murderer minutes after he'd killed his entire family. One mother told me years later that her daughter had said Isaac seemed really nice and that his costume blood looked super real. The irony was devastating. I became a forensic psychologist specifically because of Isaac. I needed to understand how someone could do what he did, how a human brain could compartmentalize murder and social pleasantries simultaneously. My doctoral thesis focused on family annihilators, people who kill their entire families. I've interviewed dozens of them, studied hundreds of cases, and the conclusion is always the same. They view their families as possessions, extensions of themselves, obstacles to be removed when inconvenient. I'm 56 years old now. I never married, never had children. The idea of creating a family terrified me after watching mine be destroyed. Every Halloween, I turn off my lights, close my curtains, and sit in silence, remembering. I think about my mother's excitement decorating the house, my father's plans to take us trick-or-treating, Nicholas's protective instincts, Hannah and Chloe's innocence and fear in their final moments. I think about the trick-or-treaters who rang our doorbell that night, unknowing participants in Isaac's grotesque performance of normalcy. I think about how many people walked past our house, saw our elaborate decorations, saw Isaac answering the door, and thought, "What a nice family," while 5 bodies cooled inside. The house was demolished 2 years after the murders. Nobody wanted to live in a place where such horror had occurred. The lot remained empty for a decade before someone finally built a new house on it. I drive past sometimes. The new owners have children. They decorate for Halloween. Life continues, oblivious to the history beneath their foundation. People often ask me if I forgive Isaac. The question assumes forgiveness is possible, that there's a path from what he did to some form of reconciliation or peace. There isn't. Isaac took everything from me: my family, my childhood home, my sense of safety, my ability to trust. He did it without hesitation or remorse, and he'd do it again if given the opportunity. What Isaac taught me is that evil exists. Not supernatural evil, not demonic possession, not mental illness in the traditional sense. Just cold, calculating selfishness taken to its logical extreme. Isaac wanted something, and he removed the obstacles without emotional consequence. That's the horror. Not that he snapped or lost control, but that he made a rational decision based on a complete absence of empathy. The worst part: Isaac is still my brother. We share DNA, childhood memories, a family history. I remember him teaching me to ride a bike when I was 6. I remember him protecting me from bullies in elementary school. Those memories exist alongside the image of him covered in our family's blood, smiling at trick-or-treaters. Both versions are real, and I'll never reconcile them. This Halloween, like every Halloween I'll remember, I'll honor my parents' memory, my siblings' shortened lives. I'll think about the children who received candy from a killer and had no idea. I'll reflect on how thin the line is between normalcy and horror, how easily one can masquerade as the other. Real horror isn't ghosts or monsters. Real horror is your brother killing your family and then cheerfully answering the door to hand out candy. Real horror is discovering that someone you loved never actually felt love at all, that every emotion they displayed was performance. Real horror is knowing that evil doesn't announce itself with dramatic music or obvious signs. Sometimes it just rings the doorbell, smiles, and asks, "Trick or treat." They thought talking to the dead on Halloween would be fun until the dead started talking back. 4 teenagers entered that cemetery, but only one came out alive, and she hasn't spoken a word since. My name is Madison, and I'm a psychiatric nurse at a long-term care facility in Manchester, England. For the past 30 years, I've been caring for a patient, a woman I'll call Victoria, who has been catatonic since Halloween night 1994. She was 17 years old when she and 3 friends conducted a séance in an abandoned cemetery. Within 72 hours of that night, 3 of those teenagers were dead by their own hands, and Victoria retreated into a psychological state so severe that she's never emerged. This is the story pieced together from police reports, witness statements, and the journal Victoria kept until that final night. Victoria and her 3 friends, Natalie, Abigail, and Elizabeth, were typical teenagers in 1994. They attended the same school, shared interests in alternative music and horror films, and had that particular teenage fascination with the occult that seems harmless until it isn't. Halloween was their favorite holiday, and they'd been planning something special for months. A real séance in the old St. Mary's Cemetery, abandoned since the 1950s after the church burned down. The cemetery was notorious locally. Urban legends claimed it was haunted, that strange lights appeared at night, that people who entered after dark reported hearing voices and feeling presences. Most rational adults dismissed these stories as teenage imagination and local folklore, but Victoria and her friends believed, or at least they wanted to believe. The idea of actually contacting spirits, of proving the supernatural was real, thrilled them. They prepared meticulously. Victoria's journal entries from October 1994 detail their research into seances, Ouija boards, and spirit communication. They read books on the occult, watched documentaries, even consulted with a local woman who claimed to be a psychic. The woman warned them explicitly, "Don't do this. Your children playing with forces you don't understand. Whatever answers the call might not be what you expect." They ignored the warning. Teenagers always do. On Halloween night 1994, the four girls met at 11 p.m., dressed in black, carrying candles, a Ouija board, and various items they believed would help them communicate with the dead. They climbed the fence into St. Mary's Cemetery and made their way to the oldest section, where graves dated back to the 1800s. They chose a spot near a large monument, created a circle with their candles, and began. According to Victoria's journal, the last entry she ever wrote, found later by police, the séance started normally. They placed their fingers on the planchette, asked if any spirits were present, and waited. For several minutes, nothing happened. Then the planchette began to move. At first, it spelled out simple messages. Yes, when asked if a spirit was present. Many, when asked how many spirits were there. The girls were excited, convinced they'd made contact. Natalie asked, "What do you want?" The planchette moved again, spelling out, "Free." Victoria wrote that the temperature dropped suddenly. Their candles flickered despite no wind. The air felt heavy, oppressive. Elizabeth wanted to stop, said she felt sick, but the others convinced her to continue. "Just a few more questions," Natalie insisted. Abigail asked, "How did you die?" The response chilled them. Murdered, buried, forgotten. Then, without anyone asking a question, the planchette started moving frantically, spelling out message after message. "Help us. Trapped. So long. Alone. Pain. Release us." The girls tried to remove their hands from the planchette, but Victoria wrote that they couldn't. Their fingers felt stuck, as if glued to the board. The planchette continued moving faster, the messages becoming more desperate. "Let us in. Give us life. Join us. Join us. Join us." Finally, they managed to pull away, breaking contact. The planchette flew off the board, crashing against a gravestone. All four girls ran, abandoning their candles and the board, not stopping until they reached the cemetery fence. They climbed over, hearts pounding, and stood on the street trying to catch their breath. "That was too real," Elizabeth said, her voice shaking. Natalie and Abigail agreed. Victoria wrote in her journal that something felt wrong, that they'd made a terrible mistake, that she felt like something had followed them out of the cemetery, but they were too scared to go back for their belongings, too embarrassed to tell adults what they'd done. They agreed to meet the next day and never speak of it again. Victoria went home around 1 a.m., went to bed, and had nightmares. She dreamed of rotting hands reaching up from graves, of voices begging to be freed, of something dark and hungry following her. She woke up multiple times, sweating and disoriented. Her mother checked on her in the morning and noticed Victoria seemed disturbed but attributed it to Halloween excitement. The next day, November 1st, Victoria tried calling her friends. Natalie didn't answer. Neither did Abigail or Elizabeth. Victoria walked to Natalie's house and found police cars outside. A neighbor told her that Natalie had been found dead that morning. She'd hanged herself in her bedroom during the night. There was no note, no explanation, no warning signs. Her parents had checked on her at midnight, and she'd been fine. By 6 a.m. she was dead. Victoria was devastated and terrified. She tried calling Abigail and Elizabeth again. Still no answer. She went to their houses. Both were surrounded by police. Both girls were dead. Abigail had walked in front of a train at dawn. Elizabeth had drowned herself in her bathtub. 3 deaths in less than 12 hours, all by suicide, all involving girls who'd conducted a séance the night before. Police interviewed Victoria extensively. She told them everything: the séance, the Ouija board, the messages, the feeling that something had followed them. The officers were skeptical, attributing the deaths to a suicide pact or psychological contagion, the phenomenon where vulnerable individuals can be influenced by others' suicides. They found no evidence of foul play, no drugs or alcohol, no clear motive. Just 3 teenage girls who'd apparently decided simultaneously to end their lives. But Victoria knew it wasn't a pact. She'd seen her friends' fear, their desire to run, their relief at escaping the cemetery. They hadn't wanted to die. Something had been done to them. Something from that séance had attached itself to them, had driven them to suicide. Victoria began experiencing symptoms herself. She heard whispers in her bedroom at night, unintelligible but insistent. She saw shadows moving in her peripheral vision. She felt presences around her constantly, pressing on her mind. She couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't focus. Her mother took her to doctors who prescribed medication for anxiety and grief. Nothing helped. On November 3rd, 3 days after the séance, Victoria's mother found her in her bedroom, sitting on the floor, staring at the wall. She wouldn't respond to questions, wouldn't move, wouldn't react to any stimuli. Her eyes were open but vacant, as if she was looking at something nobody else could see. Her mother called an ambulance. Victoria was admitted to a psychiatric hospital. Doctors diagnosed her with catatonic stupor, possibly brought on by severe trauma from witnessing her friends' deaths. But it was more than that. Victoria had retreated completely into her own mind, fleeing from something the rest of us couldn't see or understand. She was 17 years old and would never speak, move independently, or acknowledge the outside world again. I started working at the care facility where Victoria lives in 2005, 11 years after that Halloween night. She requires total care, feeding, bathing, moving her to prevent bed sores. Her body functions, but her mind is elsewhere. Her eyes track movement sometimes, suggesting some level of awareness, but she never responds to stimuli, never shows recognition, never emerges from whatever internal space she's occupying. Her mother visits weekly, has for 30 years. She's 78 now, still coming to sit with her 50-year-old daughter, who stopped aging mentally at 17. She talks to Victoria, tells her about family news, plays music Victoria used to love. There's never any response, but she keeps coming, keeps hoping. Police recovered the Ouija board from the cemetery after the deaths. It was examined for evidence, but revealed nothing unusual, just a commercial board game. The cemetery was investigated for environmental hazards like carbon monoxide or toxic mold that might cause hallucinations. Nothing was found. The séance site was examined by a forensic team. Just old graves, some dating back 150 years. Nothing extraordinary. But something happened in that cemetery on Halloween night, 1994. 4 girls went in, curious and excited. 3 came out and killed themselves within 36 hours. 1 survived physically, but lost her mind. Coincidence? Mass hysteria? Psychological contagion? Those are the official explanations. But they don't account for the timeline, the lack of communication between the girls after the séance, or the absolute terror Victoria demonstrated before her retreat into catatonia. I've read Victoria's journal many times, kept in her medical file as part of her case history. The final entry, written in shaking handwriting, ends mid-sentence. I can feel them around me, pressing on my thoughts, trying to get in. They want me to join the others. They want me to... The entry stops there. That's where Victoria stopped writing, stopped being herself, stopped engaging with reality. Mental health professionals debate Victoria's case. Some believe she witnessed something so traumatic, her friends discussing suicide plans, that her mind broke. Others think she's experiencing a prolonged psychotic break, trapped in delusions. A few suggest she's malingering, though 30 years of consistent catatonia would be an extraordinary act to maintain. I have a different theory, one I'd never state professionally, but believe privately. Victoria is still fighting. Whatever attached itself to her friends that night in the cemetery succeeded in destroying them. But Victoria is stronger. She retreated into her mind, not as surrender, but as defense. She's still there, still conscious, still herself, but she's fighting something the rest of us can't perceive. And as long as she stays in that internal space, as long as she doesn't re-engage with the external world, whatever wants her can't win. I've cared for hundreds of patients in my career. Catatonia usually resolves with treatment, or at least shows some variation over time. Victoria's has remained absolutely consistent for 3 decades. Her vital signs are normal. Her brain scans show no abnormalities. Physically, she's healthy, but psychologically, she's somewhere we can't reach, fighting a battle we can't see. The cemetery where they conducted the séance was finally demolished in 2010. The old graves were relocated, the land cleared. The developer who purchased the property reported constant problems. Workers refusing to return, equipment malfunctions, strange sounds and feelings. The project was eventually abandoned. The land remains empty today, overgrown and avoided. A blank space in the middle of a developed area. I'm 62 years old now, nearing retirement. When I leave, someone else will take over Victoria's care, will feed her and bathe her and move her limbs to prevent atrophy. Her mother will likely pass away soon, leaving Victoria without visitors, without anyone who remembers her as she was before that night. And Victoria will continue existing in whatever space she occupies, fighting whatever she's fighting, trapped in a moment that happened 30 years ago. This story terrifies me because it has no resolution, no explanation, no justice. 3 teenagers died. 1 lost her mind, and we'll never really know why. Was it the Ouija board, the location, something they accidentally unleashed? Mass psychological suggestion, a tragic coincidence? The answer matters less than the warning. Some doors, once opened, can't be closed. Some questions shouldn't be asked. Some forces, if they exist, are better left undisturbed. Every Halloween, I think about those 4 girls entering that cemetery, excited and curious, believing themselves safe because nothing supernatural could actually be real. I think about the terror they must have felt when the planchette moved beyond their control, when they realized too late that they'd made a terrible mistake. I think about Natalie, Abigail, and Elizabeth, driven to suicide by something we can't name or understand. And I think about Victoria, still trapped, still fighting, still frozen at 17 in a battle that may never end. Real horror isn't jump scares or special effects. Real horror is 4 friends trying to have fun, and 3 of them dying mysteriously within days, while the 4th loses her mind permanently. Real horror is 30 years of unanswered questions, of a woman trapped in her own mind, of families destroyed by something that might be nothing more than tragic coincidence, or might be something far worse. Real horror is not knowing, and never being able to know what really happened that Halloween night in an abandoned cemetery when 4 teenagers tried to speak with the dead. A skeleton costume shouldn't be a death sentence, but for one 12-year-old boy it was. His last words were "trick or treat" before a bullet ended his childhood forever. My name is Lauren, and I'm a trauma surgeon in Charleston, South Carolina. On Halloween night 2016, I was the doctor on call when a 12-year-old boy named Cameron was brought into our emergency room with a gunshot wound to the chest. He'd been shot while trick-or-treating, killed instantly by a homeowner who claimed he feared for his life. What happened that night exposed the deadly intersection of paranoia, gun culture, and the erosion of community trust that's poisoning America. I'd been working as a trauma surgeon for 8 years by 2016, had seen countless gunshot victims, but nothing prepared me for seeing a child in a Halloween costume bleeding out on my operating table. Cameron arrived at 8:47 p.m., his skeleton costume soaked in blood, his trick-or-treat bag still clutched in his hand. The paramedics had worked on him during transport, but I knew immediately it was hopeless. The bullet had entered his chest and severed his aorta. He was likely dead before he hit the ground. We tried anyway. We always try. For 40 minutes, my team worked desperately to save him. Chest compressions, transfusions, everything in our arsenal. But you can't repair that kind of damage fast enough. At 9:28 p.m., I called time of death. A 12-year-old boy who'd been excited about Halloween candy was dead because someone mistook his costume for a threat. The police were already at the hospital, waiting to speak with me about the injuries. I gave them the clinical details: single gunshot wound, center mass, death likely instantaneous. Then I asked what happened. The officer's face was grim. Homeowner says the kid and his friends approached the house around 8:30. Says he saw figures in dark clothing. Thought they were trying to break in, fired through the screen door. Turns out they were just trick-or-treating. I felt physically sick. The man shot a child for walking up to his door on Halloween night. The officer nodded. Says he feared for his life. Stand your ground law might protect him. That's when I understood that Cameron's death might not result in any justice, any consequences, any acknowledgement that a terrible wrong had been committed. In South Carolina, stand your ground laws allow people to use deadly force if they believe they're in imminent danger, with no duty to retreat. The shooter could claim he felt threatened, and the law would protect him. I had to tell Cameron's parents. It's the worst part of being a trauma surgeon, walking into that waiting room, seeing the hope in their eyes, and destroying it with a few sentences. Cameron's mother, Jennifer, collapsed when I told her. His father, Damien, just stared at me, unable to process the information. He was trick-or-treating, Damien kept repeating. He was just trick-or-treating. He was with friends. It's Halloween. He was just a kid. The details emerged over the following hours and days. Cameron had been with 3 friends, all around the same age, all in costumes. They'd been going door to door in a residential neighborhood, the same route Cameron had walked for years. Around 8:30 p.m., they approached a house with its porch light on, the universal signal that the house was participating in Halloween, that trick-or-treaters were welcome. The homeowner was a man I'll call Wesley. He was 46 years old, lived alone, had no prior criminal record, but was known in the neighborhood as paranoid and reclusive. He owned multiple firearms and had expressed concerns about crime in the area, despite the neighborhood being statistically safe. According to the surviving children's statements, they walked up to Wesley's porch together, rang the doorbell, and called out, "Trick or treat," as they'd done at dozens of houses that evening. But instead of opening the door and handing out candy, Wesley grabbed his handgun, looked through his screen door at 4 children in Halloween costumes, and opened fire. The first shot hit Cameron in the chest. The other 3 children ran, screaming. Wesley fired 2 more shots, missing, before realizing what he'd done. Neighbors called 911 immediately. Cameron's friends were hysterical, covered in his blood, traumatized beyond measure. When police arrived, Wesley claimed he'd seen dark figures approaching his house and assumed they were intruders. He said he heard knocking and voices, but couldn't make out what they were saying. He claimed he feared for his life and acted in self-defense. The fact that it was Halloween night, that his porch light was on, that the dark figures were children in costumes shouting, "Trick or treat." Apparently none of that registered. The investigation revealed disturbing details about Wesley's mindset. His home was filled with conspiracy theory materials, survivalist supplies, and documentation of his belief that society was collapsing and criminals were everywhere. He'd posted on social media about his fears of home invasion, his conviction that he needed to be armed at all times, his belief that hesitation could get him killed. On Halloween night, that paranoia turned a normal childhood activity into a death sentence. Wesley saw children approaching his door, and his fear-warped mind transformed them into threats. He didn't assess the situation, didn't consider alternatives, didn't recognize the context. He simply reacted with lethal force. The prosecutor charged Wesley with voluntary manslaughter, not murder, because proving premeditation was difficult. Wesley's defense attorney argued, "Stand your ground," that Wesley had reasonably believed he was in danger and had the legal right to defend himself in his own home. The case went to trial 6 months later. I testified about Cameron's injuries, about the trajectory of the bullet, about the fact that he was shot through a closed screen door while standing on a porch. The defense tried to paint Cameron as threatening despite his age and costume, suggesting that Wesley couldn't have known it was a child, that the evening darkness made identification difficult. Cameron's 3 friends testified, describing in heartbreaking detail how excited Cameron had been about Halloween, how he'd been comparing his candy haul with theirs, how he'd been laughing seconds before the gunshot. They described the terror of seeing their friend fall, the blood, the confusion about what had happened. One boy testified that he has nightmares every night, that he can't go outside after dark anymore, that Halloween is ruined forever. Jennifer and Damien testified about Cameron's character, his kindness, his love of sports, his dreams of becoming a veterinarian. They showed photos of Cameron throughout his life, a smiling child who'd never hurt anyone, whose biggest transgression was occasionally forgetting his homework. They described the hole in their family, the empty bedroom, the unbearable silence where Cameron's laughter used to be. The defense presented Wesley as a frightened man living in a dangerous world, someone who'd made a tragic mistake but had acted within his legal rights. They showed statistics about home invasions, presented expert testimony about reaction times and threat assessment, argued that Wesley had seconds to make a life-or-death decision and couldn't have known the people approaching were children. The jury deliberated for 3 days. They found Wesley guilty of involuntary manslaughter, rejecting the stand-your-ground defense, but acknowledging that Wesley hadn't intended to kill a child. He was sentenced to 3 years in prison, 3 years for ending a 12-year-old's life. Jennifer screamed when the sentence was announced. 3 years. My son is dead forever, and this man gets 3 years. Damien had to be escorted from the courtroom, shouting about injustice, about how the system had failed their son. Wesley served 22 months before being released on parole for good behavior, less than 2 years for killing Cameron. He gave one statement to the media upon his release. "I'm sorry for the family's loss, but I was protecting myself. I had no way of knowing it was a child. I acted within my rights." That statement encapsulates everything wrong with how we approach gun violence and self-defense in America. Wesley expressed no real remorse, no acknowledgement that his paranoia and quick trigger had stolen a life, no recognition that he could have assessed the situation differently. He hid behind legal protections, behind claims of fear, behind a culture that values property protection over human life. I think about Cameron every Halloween. Our ER sees increased trauma on October 31st every year. Accidents, altercations, occasionally violence. But Cameron's case was different. This wasn't a traffic accident or a party fight. This was a child engaged in an innocent tradition, killed by an adult who'd been taught to see threats everywhere. The Halloween after Cameron's death, trick-or-treating numbers in Charleston dropped by 40%. Parents were terrified. How do you let your children go door to door when a 12-year-old was shot for doing exactly that? How do you trust your neighbors when one of them might shoot first and ask questions later? Some neighborhoods organized, supervised Halloween events, trick-or-treating in shopping centers or community centers, controlled environments where paranoid homeowners couldn't mistake children for threats. The spontaneous, community-based Halloween of previous generations was dying, replaced by fear and suspicion. Cameron's parents became advocates for gun reform and stand-your-ground law revisions. They've spent years testifying before legislators, sharing Cameron's story, begging for changes that might prevent other families from experiencing their loss. Progress has been minimal. The political forces protecting unrestricted gun rights and expansive self-defense laws are powerful. I performed surgery on hundreds of gunshot victims since Cameron. Each one reminds me that gun violence is a public health crisis, that we're allowing fear and paranoia to normalize killing. Cameron wasn't caught in crossfire or targeted by criminals. He was killed by a law-abiding gun owner who'd been culturally conditioned to see threats everywhere and respond with lethal force. Wesley lives freely now, somewhere in South Carolina. He's prohibited from owning firearms as part of his conviction, though enforcement of such restrictions is inconsistent. He gave a few interviews, claiming he's haunted by what happened, that he wishes he could take it back. But wishes don't resurrect dead children. Cameron would be 21 now, an adult with his whole life ahead of him. Instead, he's frozen at 12, buried in a cemetery, visited by parents who will never recover from his loss. His friends, now young adults, carry the trauma of watching him die. His community lost its sense of safety, and Halloween, once a night of joy and community, became a reminder of how fear can kill innocence. This story isn't about a monster or an evil person. It's about how a culture of fear, combined with easy access to deadly weapons and laws that prioritize property over life, creates conditions where children die for ringing doorbells. Wesley wasn't born a killer. He was shaped by media that profits from fear, by politics that exploits paranoia, by a gun culture that teaches shoot first as legitimate self-defense. Real horror isn't supernatural. Real horror is living in a society where a child in a skeleton costume can be legally killed for approaching a door on Halloween night, where the shooter serves less than 2 years, where nothing changes, and the same tragedy will inevitably repeat. Real horror is parents burying their 12-year-old son and hearing the killer claim he was just protecting himself. That's the true nightmare, not ghosts or monsters, but the normalized violence we've allowed to infect American life, turning childhood traditions into potential death traps. When the crowd becomes the weapon, there's nowhere to run and no one to fight. In Seoul, on Halloween 2022, 159 people died standing upright, crushed by the weight of celebration itself. My name is Samantha, and I'm an American expatriate teacher living in Seoul, South Korea. I survived the Itaewon Halloween crowd crush on October 29, 2022, a tragedy where a narrow alley became a death trap, where the sheer density of human bodies created a force that killed over 150 people in minutes. What I experienced that night changed how I understand crowds, panic, and the terrifying fragility of human bodies under pressure. I'd been living in Seoul for 3 years by 2022, teaching English at a private academy. I loved the city, safe, vibrant, with incredible food and nightlife. Halloween wasn't traditionally a Korean holiday, but Itaewon, the international district, had embraced it. Every October 31st, tens of thousands of people descended on Itaewon's narrow streets to celebrate, wearing costumes, bar hopping, enjoying the festive atmosphere. In 2022, Halloween fell on a Monday, so the major celebrations happened the weekend before, Saturday, October 29th. After 2 years of COVID restrictions limiting gatherings, people were desperate for normalcy, for celebration, for connection. Estimates suggested over 100,000 people would flood Itaewon that night. My friends and I planned to join them. We arrived around 8 p.m., a group of 5 teachers in our late 20s. The atmosphere was electric. People in elaborate costumes, music spilling from every bar and club, street vendors selling food and drinks. The main street was packed but manageable. We moved slowly, taking photos, laughing, enjoying the energy. Around 9:30 p.m., we decided to move from the main street to the back alleys, where smaller bars and clubs were located. To get there, we had to walk through a narrow alley that sloped downhill, about 4 meters wide, walls on both sides sloping steeply. This alley was a common route between different parts of Itaewon's nightlife district. As we entered the alley, I noticed it was crowded. People were moving in both directions, some going downhill toward the clubs, others coming uphill toward the main street. The flow was slow but steady. We joined the downhill stream, pressed close to strangers, but not uncomfortably so. Then the movement stopped. The crowd ahead of us had halted for some reason. I couldn't see why. People behind us continued pushing forward, unaware that the crowd ahead couldn't move. The density increased rapidly. Within seconds, I went from walking slowly to being completely unable to move my arms or legs. The pressure was unlike anything I'd experienced. Bodies pressed against me from all sides, front, back, both sides. I couldn't move forward, backward, or sideways. I could barely breathe. My ribs were being compressed by the people around me. I tried to raise my arms to create space for my chest to expand, but I couldn't move them. They were pinned to my sides. People started screaming. The sound was terrifying. Raw panic. People begging others to stop pushing, to move back. But the crowd behind us couldn't move back because more people kept entering the alley, unaware of the compression happening ahead of them. The crowd had become a hydraulic press, with human bodies as the medium. I felt my feet leave the ground. The pressure was so intense that I was being lifted by the sheer compression of bodies around me. This is when true panic set in. I was upright but not standing, held in place by human flesh pressed against me from all directions. I couldn't control my position, couldn't protect myself, couldn't do anything but exist in this crushing grip. The pain in my chest was unbearable. Each attempt to inhale was met with resistance. My rib cage couldn't expand against the pressure. I was suffocating while standing upright, surrounded by hundreds of people who were also suffocating. I could hear people crying, praying, screaming for help. I could feel bodies going limp around me as people lost consciousness. Time distorted. I don't know if I was in that crush for 5 minutes or 20. My vision started to blur. My hearing became muffled. I thought with absolute certainty that I was going to die, not from violence or accident, but from the simple physical fact of too many human bodies occupying too little space. I remember thinking about my parents, about how they'd received the news that their daughter died in a crowd crush in South Korea. I remember feeling angry that this was how my life would end, not from disease or old age, but from something as stupid as too many people in an alley. I remember the sensation of fading, of my consciousness dimming as oxygen deprivation took hold. Then somehow, the pressure eased slightly. People ahead had either fallen or broken through, creating a tiny amount of space. The crowd lurched forward. I stumbled, nearly fell over bodies on the ground, but managed to stay upright. The movement continued, and suddenly I was through the worst of it, emerging into a wider space at the bottom of the alley. I collapsed immediately, gasping for air. My chest hurt so badly I thought my ribs were broken. I was covered in other people's sweat, tears, and worse. My costume was torn. I'd lost my shoes somewhere in the crush. But I was alive. I looked back at the alley and saw absolute chaos. People were still pouring out, many falling as soon as they reached open space. Bodies were on the ground, some moving, some not. The screaming continued. And behind it all, more people kept trying to enter the alley from the top, unaware of the disaster unfolding inside. Emergency responders arrived quickly, but the scene was overwhelming. Police tried to stop people from entering the alley, but the crowd was too large, too chaotic. Paramedics were performing CPR on dozens of people simultaneously. Bodies were being carried out and laid in rows, on the street. Some were covered with blankets. They weren't coming back. I found 2 of my friends. We held each other, crying, unable to process what had happened. We couldn't find our other 2 friends. For 3 hours, we searched, checking with police, looking through crowds of survivors, visiting nearby hospitals. We finally found them at 2 a.m. One had a collapsed lung and broken ribs. The other had been unconscious for 20 minutes but survived. The final death toll was 159 people, with 196 more injured. Most victims were young, in their 20s and 30s there to celebrate Halloween. They died from compressive asphyxiation. their lungs physically unable to expand against the pressure of surrounding bodies. Some died from traumatic injuries when they fell and were trampled. Many were foreign nationals like me, living in or visiting Seoul. The investigation revealed a cascade of failures. The police knew that over 100,000 people were expected in Itaewon that night, but deployed only 137 officers to manage them. There was no crowd control plan, no barriers to regulate flow, no monitoring of the narrow alley. Multiple emergency calls had been made before the crush, with callers warning that the alley was dangerously crowded, but no action was taken. The crush happened because people kept entering a space that was already full. The alley's downward slope meant gravity naturally pulled people forward. When the crowd at the bottom stopped moving, possibly because someone fell, the pressure built rapidly. The people in the middle had no control. They couldn't move forward because bodies blocked them. They couldn't move back because thousands of people behind them were pushing forward. They were trapped in the physics of crowd dynamics. Crowd crush experts explained that once density reaches a certain point, about 6 to 7 people per square meter, the crowd becomes a fluid. Individual agency disappears. You don't decide where to move. The crowd moves you. Pressure waves travel through the mass, pushing people in directions they don't intend. Falls become inevitable. And once people are on the ground, they're trampled by people who physically cannot stop moving, because they're being pushed by the mass behind them. The psychological aftermath has been devastating. I have PTSD that manifests as intense claustrophobia and panic in crowds. I can't ride the subway during rush hour. I can't attend concerts or festivals. Even busy sidewalks trigger anxiety. My therapist says I may never fully recover. The experience of believing you're dying, of being completely powerless, creates trauma that doesn't heal easily. Survivor's guilt is constant. Why did I survive when 159 others didn't? I wasn't stronger or smarter. I was just positioned slightly differently, arrived seconds earlier or later, had marginally more luck. That randomness is hard to accept. I met with families of victims, parents who lost children, spouses who lost partners. Their grief is bottomless, and I have no answer for why their loved one died while I lived. South Korea went into national mourning. The government faced intense criticism for the lack of crowd control, for ignoring warning signs, for treating a foreseeable risk as an unpredictable accident. Officials resigned. New crowd management laws were proposed, but legislation doesn't resurrect the dead or heal the survivors. Halloween celebrations in Itaewon were canceled the following year. The alley where it happened became a memorial site, covered with flowers, photos, and letters from families. I visit sometimes, reading the messages, remembering the faces I saw that night, honoring the people who died doing exactly what I was doing, trying to have fun on Halloween. This tragedy wasn't caused by evil or malice. It was caused by negligence, poor planning, and underestimating the dangers of large crowds. The people who died weren't doing anything wrong. They were celebrating, socializing, enjoying life. They walked into an alley, and the sheer density of human bodies killed them. I'm 33 years old now. The crush happened 2 years ago, but I live with it every day. I see crowds differently, not as groups of individuals, but as potential disasters, as physics problems waiting to go critical. I calculate exit routes automatically. I position myself near edges, never in centers. I watch for signs of density increasing beyond safe levels. My friend with the collapsed lung returned to America and hasn't left her hometown since. The one who was unconscious quit teaching and became a therapist specializing in trauma. We don't talk about that night often. It's too painful, too immediate. But it's always there. A shared experience that bonded us and broke us simultaneously. Real horror isn't supernatural entities or individual killers. Real horror is dying in a crowd of people trying to have fun, killed by the simple physics of too many bodies in too little space. Real horror is gasping for air while standing upright, unable to move, unable to help yourself, slowly suffocating as your consciousness fades. Real horror is surviving and knowing that your survival was random luck, that you were inches and seconds away from being one of the 159 names on that memorial. Halloween should be about joy and celebration, but for those of us who survived 81, it's a reminder of how quickly celebration can become catastrophe, how thin the line is between fun and tragedy, and how the weight of humanity itself can become the deadliest force imaginable. Blood in a child's mouth tastes like metal and terror, especially when it comes from biting an apple. In New Jersey in 1982, Halloween candy became a weapon that turned trick-or-treating into surgery and childhood into fear. My name is Ashley, and I'm a pediatric emergency room nurse in Newark, New Jersey. On Halloween night 1982, I was working the night shift when multiple children arrived with catastrophic mouth and throat injuries from biting into apples that had been deliberately embedded with razor blades. What happened that night wasn't an urban legend or a hoax. It was real, calculated violence against children that changed Halloween forever and inspired copycats across the nation. I'd been working in pediatric emergency care for 5 years. By 1982, had seen countless injuries, broken bones, burns, accidental poisonings, but nothing prepared me for the first child who came through our doors at 9:17 p.m. on October 31st, 1982. His name was Preston, and he was 7 years old. His father carried him in, the boy's Spider-Man costume soaked in blood. Preston was crying and choking, blood pouring from his mouth. His mother was hysterical, screaming, "He bit an apple. There was something in it." We rushed Preston into a treatment room. When I examined his mouth, I nearly vomited. Deep lacerations covered the inside of his cheeks, his tongue, his soft palate. Something sharp had sliced through soft tissue with surgical precision. His father handed me the apple Preston had bitten. A fresh, shiny red apple, the kind often given out on Halloween. Embedded in the flesh of the apple were 3 industrial razor blades, positioned so that biting down would drive them deep into a child's mouth. Preston required immediate surgery. The blades had cut through his tongue partially, severed blood vessels in his cheeks, and created deep wounds in his throat. The oral surgeon worked for 3 hours to repair the damage, stitching torn tissue, stopping bleeding, trying to save as much function as possible. Preston survived, but would need years of reconstructive surgery and speech therapy. While Preston was in surgery, 2 more children arrived with identical injuries. Then another. Then 3 more. By midnight, we had 7 children with severe mouth and throat lacerations from biting razor blade embedded apples. All the apples looked the same. Fresh, perfect. The kind of wholesome treat parents encouraged their kids to accept instead of processed candy. The police were called immediately. Detectives interviewed parents about where the apples had been obtained. The pattern was chilling. All 7 children had received apples from the same neighborhood, a middle-class area where families knew each other, where Halloween was usually safe and community-oriented. Someone in that neighborhood had deliberately weaponized fruit, had carefully inserted razor blades into apples, and had handed them to children with a smile. The investigation intensified throughout the night. Police went door to door in the neighborhood, asking who had given out apples. Several families admitted to distributing apples. They thought they were being health conscious, offering fruit instead of sugary candy. But their apples were innocent. The weaponized apples had come from somewhere else. Around 2 a.m., police found the source. A man I'll call Gregory, who lived on the edge of the neighborhood, had distributed the razor blade apples. When police searched his home, they found more apples in his refrigerator, already prepared with blades inserted deep into the flesh, the insertion points carefully concealed. He'd created approximately 20 of these weapons, distributed 7 before being discovered. Gregory was arrested immediately. During interrogation, he showed no remorse. When asked why he'd done it, he gave a chilling answer. I wanted to teach people a lesson about trusting strangers. Everyone's too comfortable, too naive. They needed to learn that the world is dangerous. This wasn't a random act or a prank gone wrong. Gregory had deliberately targeted children to prove an ideological point about trust and danger. He'd purchased industrial razor blades specifically for this purpose, spent hours carefully embedding them in apples, then handed them to trick-or-treaters while their parents watched, assuming a neighbor offering fresh fruit was being kind and health-conscious. The medical aftermath was devastating. Preston, the first victim, required 5 surgeries over 3 years. He lost partial function of his tongue, affecting his speech permanently. Another child, a 9-year-old girl, had severed an artery in her throat and nearly bled to death before paramedics arrived. A 6-year-old boy required reconstructive surgery to repair his soft palate and spent months learning to eat solid food again. The psychological damage extended beyond the injured children. Every child who'd trick-or-treated in that neighborhood became terrified of Halloween candy. Parents across New Jersey, and eventually nationwide, panicked. Hospitals offered free X-ray services to scan Halloween candy. Parents meticulously inspected every piece of candy their children received, throwing away anything that looked remotely suspicious. The trial began in spring 1983. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence: the prepared apples found in Gregory's home, witness testimony from parents who'd seen him handing out apples, medical evidence from the injured children. Gregory's defense tried to argue temporary insanity, claiming he'd had a mental breakdown. Psychiatric evaluations revealed that Gregory had antisocial personality disorder, but was legally sane, fully aware that his actions would harm children. I testified about Preston's injuries, describing in clinical detail the damage the razor blades had caused. I testified about the other children, about the hours of surgery required, about the permanent disabilities some would face. I watched the jury's faces as I spoke: horror, disgust, anger. Several jury members cried. Gregory showed no emotion during the trial. He sat calmly, occasionally taking notes, treating the proceedings like an academic exercise. When given the opportunity to speak, he expressed no remorse for the children he'd harmed. Instead, he lectured about societal complacency and the importance of vigilance. It was clear he viewed himself as a teacher delivering a harsh but necessary lesson. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Gregory was convicted on 7 counts of aggravated assault and 7 counts of child endangerment. He was sentenced to 25 years in prison with no possibility of parole. The judge, during sentencing, called Gregory's actions among the most calculated and cruel he'd encountered, noting that weaponizing Halloween candy represented a profound betrayal of community trust and childhood innocence. But the damage extended far beyond Gregory's victims. His actions inspired copycat attacks. Within 2 years, similar incidents were reported across the United States. Razor blades in apples, needles in candy bars, poison in chocolates. Most were hoaxes or false reports, but some were real. Halloween, once a carefree celebration of childhood imagination, became an exercise in paranoia and fear. The razor blade in Halloween candy became an enduring urban legend, repeated every October despite being statistically rare. But for those of us who witnessed the real thing, who treated the real victims, it wasn't a legend. It was a nightmare made flesh, a demonstration of how easily trust can be weaponized and innocence destroyed. I continued working in pediatric emergency care for another 25 years after that Halloween. I saw many injured children, many tragedies, but Preston's face, a 7-year-old in a Spider-Man costume, blood pouring from his mouth, terror in his eyes, haunted me differently. He'd been hurt by someone he'd trusted, someone his parents had trusted, someone the community had assumed was safe because he was a neighbor. Preston is 49 years old now. I saw him a few years ago at a hospital fundraiser. His speech is still affected by the injuries, certain sounds difficult for him to pronounce. He told me he's never celebrated Halloween since 1982, that he can't be around children in costumes without experiencing panic attacks. He married but chose not to have children because he couldn't bear the thought of them trick-or-treating, of them trusting strangers who might harm them. The other victims carry similar scars. The girl who nearly bled to death developed severe anxiety and trust issues. The boy with the reconstructed palate has recurring nightmares. Several changed their names as adults, wanting to escape the media attention that followed them for years after the incident. They were marked by Gregory's actions, their childhoods redefined by a single moment of biting into an apple. Gregory served his full 25-year sentence. He was released in 2000, now in his 70s, still showing no remorse. He gave one interview after his release, claiming he'd been right to teach people about stranger danger, that the children's injuries were unfortunate but necessary to wake society up. The interviewer ended the segment early, too disgusted to continue. The neighborhood where it happened never fully recovered. Property values dropped. Families moved away. Halloween participation declined dramatically. The sense of community trust that had existed before 1982 was shattered. Neighbors eyed each other with suspicion. The annual Halloween block party was canceled and never resumed. I think about that night often, about the moment Preston's father carried him through our doors, about the realization that someone had deliberately harmed children to prove a point. Gregory's actions weren't passion or temporary insanity. They were calculated cruelty dressed up as philosophy. The worst part is that Gregory succeeded in his stated goal. He did teach a lesson about trust and danger. Children across America learned to fear their neighbors, to view Halloween candy as potentially deadly, to approach celebration with suspicion. He destroyed the innocence and community trust that made Halloween special, replacing it with X-ray machines and parental paranoia. Real horror isn't monsters or supernatural threats. Real horror is a neighbor carefully inserting razor blades into apples, knowing that children will bite into them, viewing their inevitable injuries as an acceptable cost of teaching a lesson. Real horror is a 7-year-old requiring reconstructive surgery because an adult decided to weaponize childhood trust. Real horror is the knowledge that acts like Gregory's can never be fully prevented because they rely on the very trust and community spirit that make neighborhoods livable. I'm 68 years old now, retired from nursing. Every Halloween, I remember Preston and the other children, their blood-soaked costumes, their terrified cries. I remember the hours of surgery, the years of recovery, the permanent scars, physical and psychological. And I remember Gregory's calm face, his complete lack of remorse, his conviction that harming children was justified. Halloween should be magical. Children pretending to be heroes and monsters, neighbors sharing treats, communities coming together in celebration. But for those of us who witnessed what happened in Newark in 1982, Halloween is a reminder of how easily evil can hide behind normalcy, how trust can be weaponized, and how some scars never fully heal. The razor blades are long gone, but the wounds they created, in flesh and in spirit, remain forever. A paperboy's route should end with collected money, not with a single shoe left behind in the darkness. In Iowa in 1982, 12-year-old Johnny Gosch vanished on Halloween evening, and America's innocence disappeared with him. My name is Stephanie, and I'm a retired FBI agent who spent 27 years working missing children cases. Johnny Gosch's disappearance on Halloween 1982 became the case that defined my career and changed how America protects its children. What happened to Johnny remains partially unsolved even today, but what we discovered during the investigation revealed a horror far worse than anyone imagined. An organized network that targeted children and a system that failed to protect them. I was a young agent in 1982, assigned to the Des Moines field office. On the morning of Halloween, I was reviewing routine case files when the call came in around 8 a.m. A 12-year-old paperboy named Johnny Gosh hadn't returned from his Sunday morning route. His parents were frantic. Local police were treating it as a possible runaway, but something about the call felt wrong. Johnny's mother, a woman I'll call Kimberly, insisted her son would never run away. He was responsible, reliable, excited about Halloween later that evening. He'd left at 6 a.m. to deliver newspapers in their West Des Moines neighborhood, a route he'd walked dozens of times. He should have been home by 7 a.m. When 8 a.m. came with no sign of Johnny, Kimberly drove the route and found his wagon abandoned 2 blocks from home, newspapers still inside. One of Johnny's shoes was on the sidewalk nearby, as if it had fallen off during a struggle. I arrived at the Gosh home by 10 a.m. Local police were still treating it as a likely runaway despite the abandoned wagon and shoe. This was 1982. There were no Amber Alerts, no national missing children databases, no immediate large-scale responses to child disappearances. The first 48 hours were wasted on procedural delays while Johnny's trail went cold. Kimberly described Johnny as a normal kid. Good grades, active in sports, close with his family. He'd been excited about trick-or-treating that evening with friends, had his costume ready, had made plans. Nothing suggested he'd run away, but several witnesses had seen something disturbing that morning. A neighbor reported seeing a man in a blue car talking to Johnny around 6:15 a.m. Another witness saw 2 men near Johnny's route around the same time. A third witness reported seeing Johnny approach a car, speak to someone inside, then walk around to the passenger side. The car drove away. Johnny's shoe was found approximately where this interaction occurred. The investigation intensified once we had witness statements suggesting abduction rather than a runaway. We canvassed the neighborhood, interviewed everyone on Johnny's paper route, tracked down owners of blue cars, but we were already hours behind. By the time we had a coordinated search going, Johnny had been gone for over 12 hours. Halloween night came, and Johnny wasn't home to trick or treat. His friends went door to door while Johnny's face was being distributed on missing person flyers. The contrast was devastating. Children celebrating while one of their own was missing, possibly in danger, possibly worse. Days turned into weeks with no trace of Johnny. No body was found. No ransom demand was made. No confirmed sightings emerged. He had simply vanished, as if the earth had swallowed him. Kimberly appeared on every news program that would have her, begging for information, pleading with whoever had taken her son to return him. The case went cold. Leads dried up. Other cases demanded attention. But I couldn't let it go. I continued investigating on my own time, following tenuous connections, interviewing witnesses repeatedly, looking for the detail we'd missed. 3 years later, in 1985, another boy disappeared under similar circumstances in a nearby state. Then another. Then another. A pattern emerged. Young boys, taken in broad daylight, seemingly by people who knew how to abduct children without leaving evidence. The FBI opened a task force investigating possible connections between these disappearances. What we discovered was horrifying. Evidence suggested an organized network involved in child trafficking, using multiple abductors across different states, moving children quickly to avoid detection. These weren't random crimes of opportunity. They were coordinated operations by people who'd perfected the abduction and concealment of children. In 1989, 7 years after Johnny's disappearance, I received an anonymous phone call, a man's voice, muffled and brief. Johnny Gosh was taken by an organized group. He's alive. He was trained and used. You won't find him because he's not who he was. The line went dead. I traced the call but found nothing. But the message haunted me. Trained and used. What did that mean? We'd considered trafficking, exploitation, horrible possibilities. But trained. It suggested something more organized, more systematic than we'd imagined. In 1997, 15 years after Johnny's disappearance, Kimberly received a late-night visit. She claimed a young man appeared at her door around 2:30 a.m., told her he was Johnny, showed her a birthmark only Johnny would have, told her he'd been taken by an organized group involved in child exploitation, that he'd been moved across the country, that he'd been traumatized beyond measure. He stayed for approximately 90 minutes, then left, saying it wasn't safe for him to stay longer. Kimberly was absolutely convinced it was Johnny. But he didn't stay, didn't go to police, didn't provide evidence. Skeptics questioned whether the visit really happened, whether grief had caused Kimberly to imagine what she desperately wanted to be true. The FBI investigated but found no evidence to confirm or deny her account. I spoke with Kimberly after her claimed visit. Her description of the young man, his knowledge of family details, the birthmark. It was compelling, but without physical evidence, without the person present for DNA testing or formal identification, we couldn't confirm anything. In 2006, another break came. A woman came forward claiming she'd been held by the same organization that took Johnny. She described a network that abducted children, moved them across state lines, used them for exploitation, and sometimes trained older children to help abduct younger ones. Her testimony was disturbing and detailed, but also difficult to verify. The investigation revealed connections to multiple unsolved child abductions across the Midwest during the 1980s and 1990s. Evidence suggested coordination between abductors, safe houses where children were held, methods for avoiding detection. But prosecuting these cases was nearly impossible. Witnesses were unreliable, evidence was circumstantial, and many years had passed. Johnny Gosch's case officially remains unsolved. He's never been found, confirmed alive or dead. His mother believes he's alive, that he survived his ordeal but can't come home for reasons connected to what happened to him. Skeptics believe he's likely deceased, that his body was hidden or destroyed, that Kimberly's claimed visit was grief-induced delusion. I retired from the FBI in 2009, having worked missing children cases for 27 years. Johnny's case was the one I never solved, the one that haunted me through my entire career. I've worked hundreds of cases, solved many, brought closure to families, put predators in prison. But Johnny Gosch remained the ghost that followed me. What I learned from Johnny's case changed how America responds to missing children. The slow initial response, the lack of coordination between jurisdictions, the absence of national databases, all these failures were exposed by cases like Johnny's. The result was the creation of the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, the implementation of Amber Alerts, better coordination between law enforcement agencies, and faster responses to child abductions. Johnny's face appeared on milk cartons nationwide, one of the first missing children to be featured this way. His case raised awareness about child abduction in ways no previous case had. Parents became more protective, more aware of dangers. Children were taught about stranger danger, about not getting into cars, about trusting their instincts. But awareness and systems couldn't bring Johnny home. Kimberly spent the rest of her life searching, advocating, refusing to believe her son was dead. She appeared on television regularly, kept Johnny's room exactly as he'd left it, maintained hope despite decades without confirmation. She passed away in 2019, never having confirmed answers about what happened to her son. I'm 71 years old now. Johnny would be 55 if he's still alive. Sometimes I imagine him living under a different name, carrying trauma he can't speak about, unable or unwilling to reconnect with his past. Other times, I accept the statistical likelihood that he didn't survive long after his abduction. The truth is, we may never know with certainty what happened to Johnny Gosch. The investigation remains technically open, but active leads dried up years ago. His case file sits in archives, representing not just one missing boy, but the thousands of children who disappeared before systems existed to find them quickly. What haunts me most is the shoe. That single shoe on the sidewalk, evidence of a struggle, proof that Johnny didn't go willingly. I think about those final moments of normalcy. A 12-year-old boy delivering newspapers on Halloween morning, excited about trick-or-treating that evening, unaware that someone was watching him, waiting for the right moment to strike. Real horror isn't fictional monsters. Real horror is a child vanishing in broad daylight while delivering newspapers, leaving behind only a shoe and decades of unanswered questions. Real horror is a mother spending 37 years searching for her son, dying without confirmation of his fate. Real horror is organized networks that target children, operate with impunity, and leave families destroyed in their wake. Johnny's case taught me that evil isn't always dramatic or obvious. Sometimes it's a car pulling up next to a paperboy, a brief conversation, a child getting into a vehicle and vanishing forever. Sometimes it's systematic, organized, involving multiple people working together to destroy innocents and families. If you're watching this, if you have information about Johnny Gosch or any missing child, please come forward. Cases decades old can still be solved. Families still need closure. Children still need justice. Johnny deserved to grow up, to celebrate Halloween, to live a full life. Instead, he became a symbol of every parent's nightmare and every child's vulnerability. The shoe remains in evidence storage somewhere, a small piece of leather representing the moment a childhood ended and a family was destroyed. I think about it often. That abandoned shoe on a Des Moines sidewalk on Halloween, morning 1982, silent testimony to a crime that was never fully solved and a boy who never came home. If these true Halloween horror stories disturbed you, affected you, or made you think differently about safety and evil, please subscribe to Haunted Fears. Share these stories so others understand that real horror exists in our world, often hiding behind normalcy. Hit the notification bell to never miss a story, and comment below with your thoughts, your location, and what time you're watching. Stay safe out there, and remember, the scariest stories are the ones that really happened.